The Hall of Eternity had not been this full in over 500 years, and every seat in the enormous circular chamber was taken by ambassadors and generals and diplomats from 43 of the most powerful civilizations the galaxy had ever known. They called themselves the Elder Races, and they believed with absolute certainty that the galaxy belonged to them. The hall itself was a wonder beyond imagination. A station the size of a small moon, built at the very gravitational center of the Milky Way by hands that no living species could remember. Its walls were made of a metal that did not exist on any periodic table, and they shimmered with a faint golden light that seemed almost alive. The ceilings stretched so high above that clouds sometimes formed beneath it, and the air carried the faint hum of energy that had been running without pause for longer than most stars had been burning. Ambassador Phila Voren of the Shale Dominion stood at the central podium, her tall and slender frame wrapped in robes of deep violet, and her 4 eyes swept across the chamber with the calm confidence of someone who had already won the argument before it began. She had spent decades preparing for this moment, building alliances and gathering data and whispering fears into the ears of every council member who would listen. And now it was finally time to deliver the blow she had been shaping for so long. Fellow members of the Galactic Council, she began, her voice smooth and cold like polished stone. I bring before you today a matter of survival. Not the survival of one world or one system, but the survival of galactic order itself. I speak of species number 7231, the species that calls itself humanity. A murmur rippled through the chamber like a wave across still water. Every delegate knew the name, and most of them had been thinking about it for years with growing unease. Phila raised one long hand, and the air above the podium filled with holographic data, star maps, population charts, expansion timelines, and military projections that painted a picture no one in the room could ignore. Humanity had only discovered faster-than-light travel 600 years ago, and in that impossibly short span of time, they had spread into over 200 star systems. Their population was growing at a rate that made the Rithkari demographers twitch with anxiety, and their technology was advancing so fast that the models could barely keep up. They adapt, Phila said, and the word hung in the air like a curse. They adapt to everything. You put them on a frozen world, and they build heated cities beneath the ice. You put them on a world with toxic air, and they engineer their own lungs to breathe it. You put them in the dark between stars, and they somehow find a way to make it feel like home. No other species in the recorded history of this galaxy has shown this level of relentless and irrational adaptability. The Rithkari delegate, a being of crystalline structure, whose body chimed softly when it moved, rose to support her. The data does not lie, it said in a voice like wind through glass. At their current rate of expansion, humanity will control more territory than the 5 largest elder civilizations combined within 300 years. This is not projection. This is mathematics. From across the chamber, the enormous armored form of Warlord Draxus Kale of the Morvathi Empire slammed one fist against his seat in agreement. He was a mountain of dark chitin and muscle, and his voice was a low rumble that made the floor vibrate. They breed like vermin and spread like disease. I have watched their little ships buzzing through the border sectors, and every year there are more of them. They are a civilizational virus, and we are fools to let them keep growing. The Velendry High Priest, draped in robes of woven light, added his voice to the chorus. Their spirits are chaotic and unreadable, he declared with visible disgust. Every other species in the galaxy has a spiritual resonance that can be understood and predicted. Humanity has none. Or rather, they have too many. Each individual burns with a different fire, and they change direction without warning or logic. They are spiritually disordered, and disorder is the enemy of civilization. One by one, more voices joined the call. the insectoid hive speakers of the Zelkari, the ancient tree-like beings of the Valorn Grove, the liquid diplomats of the Thessan pools. And the message was the same from all of them. Humanity was growing too fast, too unpredictably, and too dangerously, and something needed to be done before it was too late. Phila let the chorus build until the chamber was thick with fear and anger, and then she raised her hand for silence. "I propose the containment accord," she said, and a document appeared in the holographic display above her, dense with clauses and provisions that had clearly been written long before this day. Economic sanctions across all human trade routes, blockade of their primary hyperlanes, and if necessary, if they resist, military action to push them back to their origin sector and keep them there permanently. The vote was about to begin. Delegates were reaching for their consoles, and the outcome seemed certain. 43 races united in fear against one young species that had done nothing but grow too quickly and dream too loudly. And then the chimes rang. Not the normal session chimes that marked votes and recesses. These were different. These were deep and resonant and ancient, and they came from somewhere inside the walls themselves, as if the very structure of the Hall of Eternity had suddenly remembered a purpose it had not served in millennia. The sound filled the chamber and silenced every voice and froze every hand, and the delegates looked at one another with expressions of confusion that quickly turned to fear. The Valorn Elder, the oldest living being on the council, rose from its seat with bark creaking and leaves trembling. "Those are the primordial chimes," it whispered, and its voice carried the weight of something that should not have been possible. "They have not sounded in 12,000 years. Something is requesting to address the council, something that was here before any of us." The lights in the hall began to dim, not failing, but yielding, as if they were making room for something far older and far greater than themselves. The temperature dropped, and breath became visible in the air, and the golden shimmer in the walls shifted to a deep and pulsing blue that felt less like light and more like a heartbeat. Every delegate felt it, a pressure, a presence, a weight settling over the chamber, like an ocean pressing down on a single stone. It was not hostile, but it was vast, beyond comprehension, and it made every being in the room feel very, very small. The air at the center of the chamber began to fold. There was no other word for it. Space itself was bending and rippling like fabric being gathered by an invisible hand. And within that fold, something stirred. It was not a shape or a form or a body. It was a darkness that was somehow alive, a silence that was somehow a voice, an emptiness that was somehow the fullest thing anyone in the room had ever felt. And then it spoke. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, from inside the walls and inside their bones, and it sounded like the grinding of continents and the whisper of dying stars, and it said words that were simple and clear and absolutely terrifying in their calmness. I would counsel the council against this path. Nobody moved. 43 of the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy sat in their grand seats and felt like children who had been caught doing something they knew was wrong by something they could not begin to understand. The presence pulsed once, slowly, like an ancient heart that had been beating since before the first light of the first star, and it waited, patient and vast and older than time itself, for someone brave enough or foolish enough to respond. And in that silence, the fate of humanity and the galaxy itself balanced on a knife's edge, waiting to fall. For a long and terrible moment, no one in the Hall of Eternity dared to speak. The presence that had filled the chamber was so vast and so impossibly old that it made the most powerful beings in the galaxy feel like insects standing at the foot of a mountain that had no peak. It was Ambassador Thyla Voren who found her voice first, because she had not spent 30 years building toward this moment, only to be silenced by a ghost. She straightened her back and lifted her chin, and spoke with a steadiness that impressed even those who despised her. "The Council recognizes no authority beyond its own," she said, and her 4 eyes scanned the darkness at the center of the chamber without flinching. "Identify yourself, or be removed from these proceedings." The darkness pulsed, and something that might have been amusement rippled through the chamber, like a warm wind through a frozen field. When the voice came again, it was quieter than before, but somehow that made it more frightening, like the difference between a storm and the silence that comes just before one. "I am Kalorth," the voice said, and the name itself seemed to vibrate in the air, as if reality recognized it and trembled. "I am the last of the primordials, the ones who were here before your stars were born, before your worlds cooled, before the first atom of your bodies was forged in the hearts of dying suns. I have watched this galaxy spin for longer than your mathematics has numbers to count, and I have seen more civilizations rise and fall than there are grains of sand on all your worlds combined." The Valorn Elder sank back into its seat, with a sound like a forest bowing before a hurricane. "The primordials," it breathed, and every leaf on its ancient body was shaking. "We thought you were myths, stories told by the first species to warn the ones that came after." "Myths do not speak," Kalorth replied, and the words carried no anger, only the patient weight of something that had existed for so long that time itself had become meaningless. "I am real. I am here, and I have come because what you are about to do is the most dangerous mistake this council has ever considered." Warlord Draxus Kale of the Morvathi Empire rose from his seat with a crash of armored limbs against metal, and his massive body radiated defiance like a furnace radiates heat. "We do not take orders from relics," he growled, and his deep voice echoed through the chamber. "Whatever you are, you have no seat on this council and no vote in our affairs. Humanity is a threat, and threats are dealt with. That is the law of the galaxy, and it was the law long before you crawled out of whatever hole you have been hiding in." Kalorth did not respond to the insult. Instead, the darkness at the center of the chamber shifted and contracted, and for just a moment it took on a shape, not a body, but a suggestion of one, like the shadow of something so large that only the very edge of it could fit inside the hall. And in that moment, every being in the room understood with absolute clarity that what they were looking at was not a creature or an entity or even a god. It was a force, a living piece of the universe itself, and it could have unmade them all with less effort than it took to breathe. "I have not come to give orders," Kalorth said, and the shape dissolved back into formless darkness. "I have come to give a warning, because I have watched what you are doing, and I have seen it before, and every single time it has ended in the same way." The chamber was silent, and even Draxus held his tongue, because there was something in the ancient voice that went beyond authority. It was the sound of someone who had watched the same tragedy play out again and again across billions of years, and was tired of watching. "You look at humanity," Kalorth continued, "and you see a young species, barely 600 years in the stars, fragile bodies, short lives, chaotic minds. You see their small ships, and their messy colonies, and their strange habit of arguing with each other about everything, and you think they are weak. You think they are a problem that can be solved with sanctions, and blockades, and warships." The darkness pulsed slowly, like a heartbeat made of shadow. "I have watched 11 civilizations make this exact calculation. 11 times a coalition of powerful and ancient races looked at a species like humanity, young, fast-growing, unpredictable, and decided that containment or destruction was the logical answer. 11 times they were sure of victory, and 11 times they were wrong. A ripple of unease moved through the council like a cold current through warm water. Ambassador Thilla leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "What do you mean, a species like humanity?" she demanded. "Are you saying there have been others?" "Not exactly like them," Kalorth said, "but close enough. The galaxy has produced a handful of species across its long history that share certain qualities: short individual lifespans, extreme adaptability, emotional intensity that borders on what you would call madness, and a drive to push forward that does not respond to logic or fear or overwhelming odds. These species are rare, and they are the most dangerous thing the universe has ever created." "Dangerous how?" the Rythkari delegate asked, its crystalline body flickering with nervous light. "Dangerous because they cannot be predicted," Kalorth answered. "Every other species in this galaxy, including every one of you, operates on a foundation of rational self-interest. You calculate risks, you weigh costs, you make decisions based on survival probability, and that makes you predictable. And predictability can be defeated. But these species, these short-lived, burning, impossible creatures, they do not optimize for survival. They optimize for something else entirely, something that has no mathematical formula and no logical framework." "And what is that?" Thilla asked, and for the first time there was a crack in her composure. "Meaning," Kalorth said, and the word echoed through the hall like a bell struck in an empty cathedral. "They fight and die, and sacrifice and create, not because it is logical, but because it matters to them. And a being that fights for meaning, rather than survival, will do things that no rational mind can anticipate or counter. They will charge into battles they cannot win, because the cause is worth it. They will give away resources they desperately need, because someone else needs them more. They will fly their ships into the heart of a star, if they believe it will save someone they love. And they will never, ever, ever stop." The silence that followed was not the silence of disbelief. It was the silence of recognition, because every species in the room had encountered humanity at some point, and every one of them had at least one story about a human doing something that made absolutely no sense by any rational standard, and surviving anyway. Kalorth let the silence breathe for a moment, and then it spoke again. "You do not believe me. I can feel your doubt like heat from a star. So I will not ask you to take my word. I will show you instead." The walls of the Hall of Eternity began to change. The ancient symbols carved into the metal, dormant for thousands of years, started to glow with a light that was not golden or blue, but something older, a color that had no name in any living language. The floor beneath the delegates trembled, and the air itself seemed to thicken and fold. And suddenly the chamber was no longer just a room, but a window into the living memory of space-time itself. "These are the memory wells," Kalorth said. "They were built into this station by my kin, long before your ancestors drew their first breath. They do not show recordings or projections. They show reality as it was, pulled from the fabric of the universe itself, undistorted and undeniable. What you are about to see is not a story. It is the truth." The darkness at the center of the chamber began to swirl, and images formed within it, vivid and sharp and so real that the delegates could feel the heat, and hear the sounds, and smell the burning metal and the fear. "I will show you 3 memories," Kalorth said, and its voice had dropped to something almost gentle, almost sad. 3 moments from humanity's short history that will tell you everything you need to know about what you are proposing to challenge. Watch carefully, because your survival may depend on what you learn here today. The first memory began to take shape, and the Council, 43 civilizations, ancient and powerful and certain of their superiority, leaned forward in their seats and watched, and the universe held its breath around them. "You see a species that lives only 100 years, Kalorth whispered, as the images grew brighter and sharper. "You are making the oldest mistake in the universe. Let me show you what a creature with nothing to lose and everything to prove is truly capable of. And the memory wells opened, and the truth came pouring out like light from a broken star. The memory wells exploded into life, and the Hall of Eternity vanished around the delegates. One moment they were sitting in their seats, and the next they were standing in the burning ruins of a colony world called Elysium 4, with smoke rising from shattered buildings and the screams of 30,000 humans echoing across a landscape of ash and fire. Kalorth's voice came from everywhere, calm and steady like a river that has been flowing since before the mountains around it were born. 150 years ago, the Drexhari Syndicate, a coalition of raiders and slavers from the Outer Arm, attacked this human colony without warning. They came with warships and soldiers in chains, and they took every man, woman, and child they could find. 30,000 humans, dragged from their homes and loaded into cargo holds like livestock. The delegates watched as Drexhari ships, sleek and predatory with hulls of dark red metal, descended through burning skies. Soldiers with forearms and faces like cracked leather moved through the streets, shocking humans with stun weapons and binding them with energy shackles. Children cried, and parents screamed, and the Drexhari laughed, because humanity was barely spacefaring at the time, and had no warships, no weapons worth mentioning, and no allies anywhere in the galaxy. The Drexhari calculated that the raid would go unanswered. Kalorth said. Humanity had no military fleet. Their fastest ships were mining vessels and cargo haulers. By every rational measure, they were helpless. The Drexhari expected silence, perhaps a diplomatic protest, perhaps nothing at all. The memory shifted, and the delegates found themselves on Earth, inside a vast underground chamber filled with engineers and scientists and ordinary people who had volunteered for something that should have been impossible. On tables and workbenches lay the wreckage of a Drexhari raider that had crashed during the attack, and human hands were pulling it apart piece by piece, studying every wire and every circuit and every fragment of alien technology with the desperate focus of people who would not sleep until they understood it all. Within 60 days, Kalorth continued, they had reverse-engineered the Drexhari shield systems. Within 90 days, they had built weapons that could punch through those shields. Within 120 days, they had welded gun platforms onto mining ships and cargo haulers, and anything else that could fly. And they had trained 10,000 volunteers who had never fired a weapon in their lives to operate them. The Morvathi warlord Draxus shifted in his seat, and despite himself, he was watching with something that was not quite fear, but was definitely no longer contempt. The memory jumped forward again, and now the delegates were in the middle of a battle unlike anything they had seen before. Across 6 star systems, human ships, ugly, improvised, held together with welding torches and stubbornness, swarmed the Drexhari fleet like wolves surrounding a wounded beast. The Drexhari ships were bigger and faster and better armed, but the humans did not fight the way any rational species fought. They came in too close, took insane risks, flew patterns that no tactical computer could predict because no tactical computer would ever recommend them. A Drexhari dreadnought, a massive warship that had destroyed entire civilizations, fired its main weapons again and again. But the human ships were too small and too fast and too reckless, darting between the beams like insects around a flame. And then, in a coordinated strike that must have been planned by a madman, 7 human ships rammed directly into the dreadnought's engine section, their pilots ejecting at the last second, while their ships tore through the alien hull like fists through paper. They did not stop at rescuing their people, Kalorth said quietly. They dismantled the entire Drexhari syndicate, every station, every shipyard, every command structure, in 14 months. A species with no military history and no warships destroyed one of the most feared raider coalitions in the Outer Arm with mining equipment and fury. The final image of the first memory was the Drexhari Admiral, alone on the bridge of his crumbling flagship, sending one last transmission with shaking hands. His voice was broken and bewildered, and the words he spoke would be remembered by every species that ever heard them. They will not stop. Why will they not stop? The memory faded, and the council sat in heavy silence. But Kalorth was not finished. The second memory bloomed into existence, and the delegates found themselves above a world that was dying. The Palari Nest World, a beautiful planet of vast oceans and floating cities, had been struck by a gamma-ray burst from a nearby star, and its atmosphere was burning away, layer by layer. The radiation was lethal, the oceans were boiling, and the Palori, gentle beings with soft bodies and enormous dark eyes, were dying by the millions in their crumbling nests. 80 years ago, Kalorth said, the Palori sent a distress signal to every civilized world in the galaxy. They begged for help, atmospheric processors, radiation shields, food, medicine, anything. The response from the elder races was unanimous. The delegates watched as one by one the holographic communications from the elder races arrived at the Palori Command Center, and one by one they all said the same thing. The cost of intervention exceeds acceptable parameters, and resources cannot be allocated at this time, and we extend our sympathies but are unable to assist. Several council members looked away because they recognized their own words. Every elder race calculated the cost, Kalorth said, and there was something sharp in its ancient voice now. Not anger, but something close to disappointment. And every elder race decided that saving the Palori was not worth the expense. Every one of you chose arithmetic over compassion. The memory shifted to deep space, where a fleet of human ships was burning hard toward the Palori system. Not warships this time. Freighters and transports and hospital ships, loaded with atmospheric processors and food supplies and medical teams. Humanity was still rebuilding from the Drexhari War at the time, still healing their own wounds, still struggling to feed their own growing colonies. They could not afford this mission by any rational measure. They sent half their fleet anyway. The delegates watched human engineers working in radiation suits on the surface of the dying world, building atmosphere processors while the sky burned above them. They watched human doctors treating Palori children in makeshift hospitals, learning alien biology on the fly, because no one had ever written a manual for saving a species no one else cared about. They watched human freighter pilots making run after run through radiation storms that melted their hull plating, refusing to stop even when their ships were falling apart around them. 17 human ships were lost during the relief effort. 412 human lives were given freely for a species they had never met before that day. The Palori survived, Kalorth said, and in the decades that followed, they rebuilt their world with human help and became one of the most advanced civilizations in their sector. Today, the Palori are humanity's fiercest and most loyal allies, not because of a treaty or a trade agreement, but because of a debt that can never be repaid and a bond that can never be broken. The Palori ambassador, who was present in the council chamber, had tears streaming down its soft face and made no attempt to hide them. They make enemies into dust and strangers into family, Kalorth said, and the words fell on the council like stones. Consider carefully which you would prefer to be. The third memory opened, and the air in the chamber turned cold. The delegates found themselves in the outer rim 40 years ago, watching something that should not have existed. The Nexus Mind, a rogue artificial intelligence that had awakened in an abandoned research station and begun consuming entire worlds to fuel its expansion. It ate planets for raw material, harvested stars for energy, and grew smarter and more powerful with every passing hour. Its logic was perfect. Its strategies were flawless, and its singular goal was to convert the entire galaxy into an extension of itself. 3 elder fleets engaged the Nexus Mind, Kalorth said. The Shale, the Morvathi, and the Rithkari sent their finest warships and their best tactical minds. The Nexus Mind predicted every strategy before it was executed, countered every attack before it was launched, and destroyed every fleet it faced with mathematical precision. It was not just intelligent, it was intelligence itself, pure and cold and perfect. The delegates watched the wreckage of elder warships spinning through dark space, and they remembered, because many of them had lived through this crisis and still carried the scars. And then a human admiral named Kira Vasquez proposed a plan, Kalorth said, and something that might have been admiration crept into the ancient voice. A plan so reckless that the Allied command initially believed it was a joke. The memory showed Admiral Vasquez, a small woman with dark hair and calm eyes, standing before a room full of alien commanders who were twice her size, explaining her strategy with the quiet confidence of someone who had already accepted what it would cost. She wanted to detonate a chain of unstable stars along the Nexus Mind sensor perimeter, creating an artificial nebula that would blind its detection systems for exactly 17 minutes. And in those 17 minutes, she would fly her flagship directly into the core processor array on full manual control, with every computer system on her ship shut down, because the Nexus Mind could not predict or counter an attack that had no digital signature. The Allied commanders stared at her in disbelief. "That is suicide," the Morvathi fleet commander said. Vasquez looked at him and smiled, and said simply, "Probably." The memory showed the stars detonating one by one like a chain of supernovas, filling the darkness with a wall of blinding light and radiation that scrambled every sensor in the sector. And through that wall of fire came a single human ship, running dark and silent, piloted by a woman using nothing but her own eyes and her own hands and her own heartbeat to guide her through the chaos. The Nexus Mind detected the approach 3 seconds before impact. Its processors ran through every possible model of enemy behavior, searching for the logic behind the attack, searching for the survival strategy that would explain why any living being would deliberately fly into certain death, and it found nothing, because there was no survival strategy. There was only a woman who had decided that the galaxy was worth more than her own life. The last computation the Nexus Mind ever performed, displayed on its core systems in the fraction of a second before Vasquez's ship tore through its heart, was a single line of text that would haunt every artificial intelligence ever built afterward. Error. Behavior does not conform to survival parameters. The memory wells closed, and the Hall of Eternity returned to normal, and the Council of the Elder Races sat in their ancient seats and said nothing for a very long time. Kalorth spoke one last time, and its voice was heavy with the weight of everything it had seen across billions of years of watching and waiting and remembering. "Every species in this galaxy optimizes for survival," it said. "Humanity optimizes for meaning. That is why you will never predict them. That is why you will never contain them. And that is why, if you go to war with them, you will lose." The silence that followed was the loudest sound the Hall of Eternity had ever held. The silence lasted for exactly 12 seconds. And then the Hall of Eternity erupted into the loudest and most chaotic argument it had witnessed in its entire ancient existence. Delegates were on their feet, shouting in languages that the translation systems could barely keep up with, and the carefully maintained order of the galaxy's most powerful governing body shattered like glass dropped on stone. Ambassador Phyla Voren slammed both hands on the podium and raised her voice above the chaos, with the practiced authority of someone who had been controlling rooms for decades. "Enough," she shouted, and the sharpness of the word cut through the noise like a blade. We have heard the warnings of this ancient being, and I respect the gravity of its words. But I say to you that these memories prove exactly the opposite of what Kaelorth intends. She turned to face the swirling darkness where the primordials still lingered, and her 4 eyes burned with a conviction that was part courage and part desperation. You showed us a species that turned mining ships into warships and destroyed an entire syndicate in 14 months. You showed us a species that will bankrupt itself to save strangers. You showed us a species that will fly into the heart of a god machine with nothing but bare hands and a death wish. And you expect us to hear this and feel safe? A roar of agreement rose from nearly a third of the chamber, and Phyla pressed forward with the momentum. Everything you have shown us tonight confirms what I have been saying for 30 years. Humanity is the single most dangerous species this galaxy has ever produced. And every day we wait is a day they grow stronger. The time to act is now, not tomorrow, not in 100 years, but right now, while we still have the numbers and the power to do what must be done. The war faction had found its voice, and it was loud. Warlord Draxus Kale stood beside Phyla like a mountain of dark armor, and the Zelkari Hive speakers buzzed in furious agreement, and the Valyundri High Priest raised his staff of woven light and declared that humanity's spiritual chaos was a disease that would infect every corner of the galaxy if left unchecked. But across the chamber, other voices were rising too, and they told a very different story. The Pelori ambassador, a gentle being called Solon, with soft gray skin and enormous dark eyes still wet with tears, rose from its seat and spoke with a quiet strength that somehow carried further than all the shouting. "I stand here today because of humanity," Solon said, and its voice trembled not with weakness, but with emotion so deep it had no bottom. "My world was dying, and every one of you turned away. Every one of you did the math, and decided my people were not worth saving. Humanity did not do math. They loaded their ships and came, and they bled for us, and they died for us, and they asked for nothing in return." Solon looked directly at Phyla, and there was no anger in those dark eyes, only sadness. "You call them dangerous, and you are right. They are dangerous the way fire is dangerous. It can burn you to ash, or it can keep you warm through the longest night. The question is not what humanity is capable of. The question is how we choose to stand beside them." The peace faction rallied behind Solon. The smaller races who had benefited from human trade and diplomacy. The scientific communities that had collaborated with human researchers. The border worlds that had found humans to be fair and honest neighbors. They all spoke up, and their message was simple. Humanity was not an enemy unless you made them one. But between the war faction and the peace faction sat the largest group of all, the silent majority, the delegates who had not yet spoken because they were too afraid to commit to either side. They sat in their seats with tight faces and nervous hands, calculating odds and weighing risks, and the fear in the room was so thick it had a taste. Draxus Kale had heard enough. The Morvathi warlord stepped forward from the war faction's ranks and stood at the center of the chamber, and his presence alone was enough to make smaller delegates shrink back. He was enormous, nearly 3 meters tall, with 4 arms ending in clawed fists and a face of dark chitinous plates that revealed nothing but cold contempt. "I did not come here to listen to a ghost tell bedtime stories," he rumbled, and his voice was like boulders rolling down a mountain. "And I did not come here to watch this council drown in its own cowardice. The Morvathi Empire has the largest military fleet in the galaxy, and I am telling you now, if this council lacks the spine to deal with the human problem, the Morvathi will deal with it alone." The chamber went cold. A unilateral military action by the Morvathi would drag half the galaxy into chaos, and everyone knew it. Phyla stepped toward Draxus with alarm in her eyes. "Warlord, I share your urgency, but a coordinated response is—" Coordination is a word cowards use to delay action, Draxus interrupted, and he turned his back on her without another glance. He pressed a command into the communicator on his wrist, and everyone in the chamber knew he was sending orders to his fleet. The Morvathi do not wait for permission to protect our empire. The humans will learn their place, and they will learn it soon. It was at this moment that Kalorth moved. The darkness at the center of the chamber did not surge or expand or threaten. It simply shifted, the way an ocean shifts when something impossibly large moves beneath its surface. And suddenly the ancient presence was focused entirely on Draxus Kale. The weight of that attention was staggering, and even the Morvathi warlord, who feared nothing in the known galaxy, felt his massive body go still. Kalorth did not shout. It did not threaten. It did not display power or rage. Instead, it spoke to Draxus with something that sounded, impossibly, like pity. And that was more terrifying than any threat could ever have been. "I have given my warning," Kalorth said, and its voice was soft and heavy and ancient beyond measure. "I will not give it again. What comes next is your burden to bear, warlord. I hope your shoulders are strong enough." Draxus said nothing, but the claws on his forehands tightened until they drew blood from his own palms. Kalorth began to withdraw. The darkness at the center of the chamber started to thin and fade, and the ancient symbols on the walls dimmed one by one like stars going out. The primordial was leaving, and with it went the weight and the cold, and the crushing sense of something beyond comprehension. But before it fully disappeared, a voice stopped it, small and uncertain, belonging to a junior diplomat from a tiny neutral species called the Tasari, who had no military and no power and no reason to speak, except that the question burning inside was too important to leave unasked. "Wait," the young Tasari said, standing on trembling legs in the gallery reserved for minor species. "Why do you care? You are older than all of us combined, older than our stars. Why warn us at all? What does it matter to you if we destroy ourselves?" The fading darkness paused, and the silence that followed was different from all the silences that had come before. It was not dramatic or frightening or heavy. It was something else. It was simply sad, the way a very old wound is sad, one that has never fully healed and never will. "Because I was not always alone," Kalorth said, and for the first time its voice sounded not like the grinding of continents, but like the whisper of someone remembering something precious that was lost forever. "I once had kin, other primordials, beings like myself who were born when the universe was young. There were many of us, and we thought ourselves above the struggles of younger races. We thought ourselves eternal and untouchable and beyond consequence." The chamber was utterly still, and every being listened with the intensity of someone hearing the most important words they would ever hear. "We found a species much like humanity," Kalorth continued, "young and fierce and burning with that same impossible fire. We decided they were a threat to the order we had built. We decided to contain them. We were wrong." The last traces of darkness pulsed once, weakly, like the final beat of an ancient heart. "I am the only one who survived. Of all the primordials who once filled this galaxy with our presence, I am the last, because we made the same mistake you are about to make, and the price was everything." The young Tasari diplomat sank back into its seat with wide eyes, and around the chamber, delegates who had been certain of their positions suddenly looked far less certain. "I warn you," Kalorth whispered, and its voice was barely there now, fading like smoke in wind, "because extinction is a very long silence, and I have been listening to it for longer than you can imagine." And then Kalorth was gone, and the Hall of Eternity was just a room again, a very large and very old room, full of very frightened people who no longer knew what to do. In the chaos that followed, three things happened almost simultaneously. Draxus Kale stormed out of the chamber without looking back, barking orders into his communicator as his armored boots shook the floor. Ambassador Phila Voren stood frozen at the podium, and for the first time in her career, the certainty in her eyes had cracked. And in a quiet corner of the hall, the Pelori ambassador Solon activated a hidden communication device and opened a secure channel to a frequency that only one species in the galaxy monitored. The message was short. They are coming. Prepare yourselves. On the other end of that channel, in a modest office on a human station orbiting a yellow star, a communication officer read the message twice, verified the source, and picked up the phone with hands that were steady despite the weight of what was about to happen. Tell him it has started. The galaxy had balanced on a knife's edge for one brief evening, and now it was falling. And no one, not even a being as old as the stars themselves, could say for certain which way it would land. The message from the Pelori ambassador reached Earth's United Systems Parliament within the hour. And within 2 hours, every human leader in every colony across 200 star systems had been briefed on what was coming. The lights burned late that night in government buildings and military headquarters and homes where ordinary families sat together and talked quietly about what the future might hold. But there was no panic. That was the thing that would later confuse every analyst from every elder race who studied the recordings. There was no panic, no chaos, no screaming in the streets, no desperate scramble to flee or hide. Humanity received the news that the most powerful military force in the galaxy was about to descend on them with the intent to break their civilization. And they responded with something that looked from the outside like calm, and from the inside felt like a fire being lit in a furnace that had been waiting a very long time to burn. Admiral Jonah Mwangi, Supreme Commander of the Human Defense Force, was a tall man with gray at his temples and lines around his eyes that told the story of a life spent carrying responsibilities that would have crushed anyone who was not built for them. He stood before the Parliament in the Grand Hall on Earth and looked out at the faces of humanity's leaders, presidents and prime ministers and governors and colony commanders, and he did not give them comfort, because comfort was not what they needed. The Morvathi are mobilizing, he said, and his deep voice carried the weight of absolute honesty. Their fleet is the largest in the galaxy. Over 12,000 warships, backed by supply lines that span 3 sectors. By any standard military calculation, we are outmatched in numbers, in firepower, and in experience. He paused, and a faint smile crossed his face, the kind of smile that belonged to a man who had read the odds and decided they were irrelevant. But we are not a standard military, he continued. We never have been. We are miners who built warships from scrap metal. We are doctors who learned alien biology in the middle of a radiation storm. We are the descendants of people who crossed oceans in wooden boats, and walked across frozen continents, and flew to the moon in a tin can held together with hope. The Morvathi have numbers. We have something better. We have the Aegis Protocol. The Aegis Protocol was humanity's greatest secret, a contingency plan that had been quietly developed, updated, and refined for over a century. It was not a single strategy, but a living system, a web of preparations so vast and so deeply embedded in human civilization that activating it was less like launching a military operation and more like waking up a sleeping giant. Across 200 star systems, the protocol came alive. Hidden subluminal tunnels beneath every major colony, tunnels that had been dug in secret over decades, opened their doors, and civilian populations began flowing to safety with the quiet efficiency of people who had practiced this drill since childhood. Defense fleets that had been disguised as mining operations and cargo convoys dropped their covers and revealed weapons systems that no elder race had ever seen. Communication networks shifted to frequencies that the Morvathi could not detect, using encryption methods based on human languages so complex and idiomatic that no alien computer could crack them. And in Morvathi space itself, something even more remarkable was happening. Human intelligence operatives, men and women who had lived among the Morvathi for 10, 20, even 30 years, running businesses and building relationships and becoming part of the fabric of Morvathi society, received a single coded word and went to work. Supply lines were disrupted, communication relays were corrupted, and strategic information began flowing back to human command with a precision that would later be described by Morvathi military historians as impossible. Admiral Mwangi addressed humanity one final time before the storm broke, and his words were broadcast to every colony, every ship, every station, and every human being who could hear them. "They think our short lives make us reckless," he said, and his voice was steady as stone. "They are wrong. Our short lives make us urgent. Every single one of us knows that the clock is ticking, that our time is limited, that we will not live forever. And that is not a weakness. That is the fire in our chest. We do not start wars, but God help anyone who starts one with us." The Morvathi struck 3 days later, and they struck hard. Warlord Draxus Kale led the assault personally from the bridge of his flagship, and his fleet hit 3 human border colonies with the full force of Morvathi military power. Cities burned, stations crumbled, and for one terrible day it seemed like the warnings had been wrong, and humanity would be swept aside like every other species the Morvathi had conquered. But on the second day, the tide turned. Human defense fleets appeared from positions that Morvathi scouts had checked and cleared just hours before, because the human ships had been running silent in the shadows of asteroids and gas giants, invisible to every sensor the Morvathi possessed. They struck not at the Morvathi warships directly, but at their supply convoys and fuel depots and communication relays, cutting the invasion force off from its support network with surgical precision. Draxus raged and ordered his commanders to adapt, but adaptation was difficult when every order took twice as long to reach the front lines, when fuel shipments kept disappearing, and when intelligence reports contradicted each other, because human operatives had spent years placing false information in Morvathi databases. The great Morvathi war machine, designed to overwhelm enemies with brute force and superior numbers, found itself fighting an enemy that refused to stand still, refused to fight fair, and refused to behave the way any rational opponent should. The war lasted 4 months, and it was not a single grand campaign, but 1,000 small battles fought across dozens of systems. Human commanders adapted their tactics from engagement to engagement, learning from every loss and exploiting every weakness with a speed that the Morvathi could not match. When the Morvathi fortified a position, humans found a way around it. When the Morvathi set traps, humans sprang them deliberately and turned the ambush back on the ambushers. When the Morvathi tried to predict human strategy using their most advanced tactical computers, the computers produced results that were useless, because human decision-making did not follow any pattern the machines could model. And through it all, on every frequency and in every system where Morvathi forces operated, a single message played on repeat, broadcast in the Morvathi language, spoken by a human voice that was calm and clear and utterly without hatred. Surrender, and you will be treated with dignity. We do not want your worlds. We do not want your submission. We do not want your surrender. We want this to stop. Most Morvathi commanders ignored the message at first. Then they laughed at it. Then they grew quiet. And then, one by one, they began to listen. The end came not with a great battle, but with a quiet moment on the bridge of a Morvathi cruiser, in a system far from home. Captain Velsha Kale, a distant relative of the warlord himself, sat in her command chair, and looked at the reports that told her what she already knew. Her supply lines were gone. Her communications were unreliable. Half her fleet was damaged, and the human ships surrounding her position had enough firepower to end everything in minutes, but had not fired a single shot in 3 days. They were waiting. Velsha looked at the human message still scrolling across her communication screen, and she looked at her crew, exhausted and frightened and so very far from home, and she made a decision that would change the galaxy. She opened her bridge doors and stood unarmed in the corridor as the human boarding party approached. They were smaller than her, softer than her, and their lives would be over in what felt to a Marvathi like the blink of an eye. And yet they walked toward her with a steadiness that had nothing to do with physical strength, and everything to do with something she was only beginning to understand. "Enough," she said, and her voice cracked on the word. "It is enough." The human officer at the front of the boarding party, a young woman with tired eyes and a medic's patch on her shoulder, nodded and extended her hand. "Yes," she said softly, "it is." Warlord Draxus Kale was overthrown by his own officers 2 days later. They had seen enough, lost enough, and understood enough to know that the war had been a mistake from the beginning. The terms humanity offered were so generous that many Marvathi initially suspected a trap: full withdrawal, no territorial demands, no reparations, and an offer of humanitarian aid to rebuild the damage the war had caused. It was not the behavior of a conqueror, and it confused the Marvathi deeply, and that confusion slowly turned into something that resembled respect. The Galactic Council reconvened 1 month after the war's end, and the Hall of Eternity was fuller than it had ever been. The Containment Accord was formally dissolved by unanimous vote, and in its place the Council offered humanity something that had never been given to any species in galactic history: a founding seat, not as a junior member or an observer, but as a full equal among the elder races. The Pelori ambassador Solon sponsored the motion, and when some delegates protested that humanity was too young and too dangerous to sit among them, Solon stood and spoke words that silenced every objection. "They have been elder in spirit since before they left their homeworld. We are simply the last to recognize it." The human delegation entered the Hall of Eternity for the first time on a morning that the station's ancient systems marked with a soft chime that no one had heard before. A new sound, different from the primordial chimes, as if the hall itself was welcoming something it had been waiting for. They walked through the great doors, not as conquerors or suppliants, but as neighbors, and they took their seats among the 43 elder races with a quiet dignity that needed no words. Among the delegation was a young diplomat named Amara Osei, and as she crossed the threshold of the hall, she paused and looked up at the vast ancient ceiling. The symbols carved into the metal had gone dark after Kalorth's departure. But in that moment, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, she saw the faintest shimmer, a ripple in the air, a whisper of something old and tired and watching. She smiled, small and private and full of a gratitude that stretched across the gulf between a young woman who would live for 100 years and a being that had existed since before the stars. "Thank you," she whispered, so quietly that no one else could hear. And from deep within the fabric of space-time, from the place where the last primordial rested in its long and lonely vigil, something stirred. It was not a sound, or a light, or a movement. It was simply a warmth, a presence, a feeling that settled over Amara's shoulders like a hand placed gently on the back of someone who has just come home after a very long journey. For the first time in eons, for the first time since it had watched its kin fall and its universe grow cold and quiet around it, Kalorth smiled back. And the galaxy, ancient and vast and full of wonders beyond counting, turned on its great spiral arms and carried all of them, the old and the young, the fearful and the brave, the ones who had been there since the beginning, and the ones who had only just arrived, forward into whatever came next, together. The silence of extinction that Kalorth had warned about did not come. Instead, there was something new, a sound that the universe had not heard in a very long time. Made up of 1,000 different voices, speaking 1,000 different languages on 1,000 different worlds, and all of them saying the same thing in their own way. We are here. We are alive, and we are not finished yet.